Picture a cold November morning in 1095. A vast crowd gathers at the Council of Clermont in France. Peasants wrapped in tattered cloaks, restless knights gripping swords, bishops shimmering in ornate robes. At the center stands Pope Urban II, eyes blazing with fervor. He raises his hands. A hush falls over the restless sea of humanity, and then his voice slices through the morning fog like a sword through flesh. Deus vult, God wills it. The words ripple through the crowd, turning trembling hands into clenched fists. Urban promises them not just forgiveness of sins, but eternal paradise. A path to heaven paved with blood. But this was not an act of pure faith. Behind the Holy Theatre was a desperate scheme to unite the fractured Christian kingdoms of Europe. Knights had been fighting each other in endless local wars, draining resources and threatening the Pope's authority. Urban saw a solution: turn their swords away from each other and point them east. For landless nobles, the call meant a chance to carve out new kingdoms. For criminals, it was a final shot at redemption. For starving peasants, it was a promise of wealth beyond imagination. Each heard the same words, but saw different rewards glittering just beyond the horizon. And so, a river of humanity began to move. Men who had never traveled beyond their village borders kissed their families goodbye. Wives wept at doorsteps. Fathers laid hands on sons, praying they'd return as heroes and not as corpses. They believed they were marching for God, but they were really marching into a labyrinth of lies, violence, and betrayal, a journey that would stain the cross with blood for centuries to come. As the Crusaders trudged across Europe and into the Middle East, the sermons turned even darker. Priests and preachers fanned the flames, declaring Muslims as infidels who had desecrated the sacred lands. They claimed that Christians were tortured and holy relics destroyed, stories exaggerated or completely invented to stoke rage. Church leaders carefully painted the East as a land of devils, where nothing pure could survive. The narrative was simple, seductive, and dangerous. We are the chosen saviors, they are the enemies of God. What started as faith twisted into fanaticism overnight. The psychological manipulation was so complete that men who had never raised a hand against a neighbor became executioners in the name of Christ. Every victory was portrayed as divine favor, every slaughter as holy justice. Even young boys, too young to wield swords, were swept up in the fever, carrying wooden crosses and dreaming of martyrdom. Meanwhile, those who tried to question the mission, scholars, moderate clergy, or skeptical nobles, were quickly silenced. To doubt was to betray God. To ask questions was to risk excommunication, or worse. And back home, churches rang bells, praising victories they barely understood. Towns held feasts celebrating the liberation of distant lands. All the while, a quiet truth pulsed beneath the surface. This was not a righteous crusade. It was a continent-wide campaign of fear, propaganda, and manipulation, hidden behind silk banners and silver crosses. The path to Jerusalem was not marked by miracles, but by charred villages and rivers clogged with bodies. As the Crusader armies advanced, they moved like a plague, devouring food, burning homes, and killing indiscriminately. When they passed through Jewish communities in Europe, massacres erupted. Men, women, and children were slaughtered in synagogues, set ablaze. The Crusaders claimed they were purifying Christendom before even reaching the Holy Land. These atrocities were not commanded directly by the Pope, but they were not stopped either. A chilling silence from church leaders spoke louder than any sermon. As they moved east, their violence escalated. Local Christian and Muslim communities alike were raided for supplies and horses. Anyone resisting was labeled a traitor or heretic and executed on the spot. Entire families vanished overnight, homes reduced to ashes, prayers swallowed by screams. Finally, after years of marching and countless battles, they reached Jerusalem in 1099. It should have been a moment of divine triumph. Instead, it became one of humanity's darkest nights. The siege was brutal. Once the walls fell, no mercy was shown. Blood reportedly flowed knee-deep in the holy streets. Churches were set alight with people hiding inside, and mosques turned into slaughterhouses. Children clung to their parents, only to be cut down moments later. Those who surrendered were promised safety, only to be murdered shortly after. When the sun rose over Jerusalem the next day, it illuminated a city transformed into a graveyard. The so-called liberators stood atop towers waving crosses, oblivious to the rivers of blood pooling beneath them. The Crusaders claimed they had cleansed the holy city. In truth, they had cursed it with an unimaginable horror. This was not a holy victory. It was a stain that would echo through centuries, a reminder that faith twisted into a weapon can destroy far more than it can ever save. When these soldiers left Europe, many believed they were heroes, hand-picked by God. They carried crosses sewn onto their cloaks, whispered prayers with every step, and dreamt of heaven opening its gates at the end of their quest. But by the time they returned, if they returned at all, they were shadows of those bright-eyed warriors. They had seen horrors no sermon could prepare them for: children impaled on spears, churches filled with corpses, cities burning under crimson skies. Those who survived often returned broken in body and spirit. Knights who once boasted about divine purpose fell silent, haunted by guilt and disillusionment. The gold and land they seized turned to ashes in their hearts. Many never stepped foot in a church again, unable to reconcile what they had done with the faith they once loved. Back home, entire communities watched in horror as loved ones returned scarred beyond recognition. When the last Crusader banners finally fell, the world looked nothing like the shimmering paradise the Pope had promised. Millions lay dead. Entire cities were reduced to charred rubble. Once thriving cultures were erased, libraries burned, and sacred knowledge lost to the flames. The physical toll was staggering. Fields once lush with crops turned into muddy graves. Ancient trade routes that once linked east and west collapsed, strangling economies and plunging regions into famine. Cities like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Constantinople became battlegrounds of endless bloodshed, their holy walls echoing with screams rather than prayers. But the deeper cost was spiritual and cultural. In Europe, the church emerged richer and more powerful than ever, hoarding treasures and lands won by slaughter. Yet it lost something priceless: its moral authority. Ordinary believers began to whisper doubts in candlelit corners. Did we really serve God? Or were we pawns in a bloody game of kings and bishops? Trust between rulers and the ruled was shattered. In the Islamic world, the Crusades solidified a deep and lasting wound. For centuries, Muslims had shared scientific discoveries, medicine and art with Christian neighbors. After the Crusades, these bridges of learning and trade were reduced to ashes. Generations grew up hearing of Frankish invaders who raped, pillaged, and desecrated mosques, memories that would fuel future conflicts for centuries. Jewish communities, caught between both worlds, faced unimaginable horrors. Pogroms in Europe killed thousands even before Crusaders left their homelands. Those who survived found themselves forever marked as scapegoats, living in fear of the next mob inspired by holy rage. The dream of a united Christendom faded into a nightmare of power struggles and betrayals. Noble houses collapsed under debt from financing failed campaigns. Children grew up fatherless, families impoverished, faith twisted into fanaticism. Ultimately, the true cost of the Crusades wasn't just in the lives lost or lands stolen. It was in the seeds of hatred planted, the generations of mistrust nurtured, and the destruction of a fragile tapestry of coexistence that had once linked Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. The Holy Land was never truly liberated. Instead, it became a monument to human greed, cruelty, and the terrible price of using faith as a weapon. A price humanity continues to pay, in scars both seen and unseen. When the last battered knights limped home and the final cries faded across the deserts, the Crusades left behind a legacy far darker than any victory scroll. For centuries, these wars were taught as heroic quests, tales of valor against overwhelming odds. But peel back the golden tapestries and you'll find a story stitched in horror and betrayal. The legacy of the Crusades seeped deep into the DNA of Europe and the Middle East. Europe became obsessed with the idea of religious conquest, setting the stage for future colonial adventures cloaked in divine justification. The myth of saving souls would echo in the voyages to the Americas, Africa, and Asia, a convenient excuse for empire building and exploitation. In the Muslim world, Memories of Crusader brutality were carved into collective consciousness. From poetry to folk songs, from bedtime stories to Friday sermons, the image of the brutal Christian invader lingered. It shaped identities, alliances, and suspicions that continue to influence geopolitics even today. Even within Christianity, the Crusades planted seeds of division. The sacking of Constantinople by fellow Christians in 1204 created a rift between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches that remains to this day. The betrayal shocked Eastern Christians so deeply that centuries later, reunification remains elusive. Perhaps the most tragic lesson is how easily faith can be twisted into a blade. The Crusades show us that when religion merges with power, it can justify almost any atrocity. Mercy becomes weakness, compassion becomes treason, and God's love becomes a distant echo drowned by war drums. Generations carried these scars forward. Some buried them under silence. Others carried them like torches, fueling future violence. We're left asking, what is faith worth if it leads to hate? What is victory worth if it leaves behind empty hearts and ruined worlds? When we look at the Crusades honestly, not through the stained glass of myth, but through the raw lens of truth, we see not a holy triumph, but a chilling warning. A warning that when swords and sermons march side by side, humanity always loses. A warning echoing across time, daring us to remember that true strength lies not in conquest, but in compassion. A final echo, whispering, "Never again."